A successful but recently divorced businessman, we'll call him Michael, found himself in a position where he had to make an unexpected decision. His housekeeper, Laura, had worked at his mansion for almost 3 years, keeping everything in order and out of his way. Laura had no idea that day would be different, that he would interrupt her as she polished the shelves in his office and give her an invitation she couldn't refuse. With a touch of arrogance, Michael looked at her and said he needed her to accompany him to a business dinner that evening. But it wasn't a request, it was more of a command. Laura was stunned but kept her expression calm, understanding that she had been chosen not for her presence but because he needed someone there without a voice, someone who wouldn't draw attention. She could tell this was a big deal for Michael, an attempt to impress some powerful investors and possibly salvage a crisis at his company. While his tone had been dismissive, she saw the opportunity as her chance to prove something, to show that she could be more than just a housekeeper. When Laura arrived at the upscale restaurant, she wore a beautiful, understated dress that fit the atmosphere perfectly. Michael was waiting at the entrance, impatience written all over his face. He barely gave her a second glance, muttering, "Let's go," in a tone that made it clear he thought of her as just another accessory, something necessary but unimportant. As they entered, Laura noticed the curious glances and the subtle, evaluating looks from Michael's well-dressed colleagues and investors. Michael made only a vague introduction, brushing her off with a quick, "This is Laura, she's with me," before focusing all his attention on the investors seated around the table. To the men in suits, Laura was an unexpected presence. Her very existence at the table raised eyebrows and whispered judgments, but she noticed each glance without flinching. As the dinner progressed, Michael and the investors dove into talk of profits, projections, and the future. Laura listened carefully, absorbing the details while staying silent. However, her quiet observations didn't go unnoticed. One investor, Mr. Thompson, a tall man with a sharp gaze, leaned in with a subtle smirk and asked, "So, Laura, what's it like being here in the middle of all this business talk?" The question was laced with condescension, clearly meant to elicit a polite, dismissive response. But Laura, feeling a spark of boldness, decided not to shrink back. "Actually, it's quite fascinating," she replied with calm assurance. "Hearing about the numbers is interesting, but I think understanding the people behind the numbers is just as important." The room fell into a brief silence. Laura's unexpected response hung in the air, and she could feel the tension at the table shift. Michael's expression hardened, annoyance flickering in his eyes. Mr. Thompson, however, looked amused and even intrigued by her comment, nodding approvingly. While Michael had wanted her to fade into the background, Laura's words were opening new dynamics at the dinner. It wasn't the quiet evening he'd envisioned. Instead, Laura was finding her voice in a setting that had been designed to silence her. Laura maintained her composure, even as she sensed Michael's growing discomfort beside her. Throughout the evening, she contributed thoughtful remarks here and there, each time breaking the image Michael had tried to project of her as a passive bystander. Mr. Thompson, perhaps intrigued by her confidence and the refreshing honesty she brought to the table, continued to draw her into the conversation, asking her opinion on topics that typically wouldn't have been directed towards someone in her role. At one point, the discussion shifted to corporate social responsibility, a topic clearly foreign to Michael, who visibly tensed. As the investors began debating the merits of socially driven projects, Mr. Thompson turned toward Michael with a slight challenge in his eyes. "Does your company have any social initiatives, Michael? Any programs for giving back to the community?" Michael hesitated, fumbling for an answer. But before he could deliver a vague reply, Laura calmly interjected. "I believe supporting the community is one way companies can give back for the success they've achieved. It goes beyond just profits. It's a way to create a meaningful legacy." Her voice was steady, her tone composed. The investors exchanged surprised glances, and Mr. Thompson nodded thoughtfully. "That's quite an insightful perspective, Laura," he said, casting a glance toward Michael. The implication in his words was clear. Here was a voice worth listening to, even if Michael had not intended for it to be heard. Michael's irritation was barely masked now, his jaw clenched as he tried to contain his frustration. He'd brought Laura here to be invisible, to sit quietly as a placeholder, yet she was drawing all the attention. Worse, her ideas seemed to resonate with the investors. The controlled, predictable dinner he'd envisioned was slipping away, morphing into something entirely different as Laura's natural charisma and genuine insights took center stage. Finally, unable to hold back his irritation, Michael leaned in and addressed her directly, his tone laced with condescension. "It's easy to talk about such ideals when you don't understand the weight of leadership decisions, Laura," he said with a slight, mocking smile. "Perhaps you're speaking on things you don't fully grasp?" Laura met his gaze without wavering, sensing the challenge in his words. She could feel the silent pressure to back down, to let him reclaim control. But instead, she answered with quiet strength, "Maybe I don't know the weight of those decisions firsthand. But sometimes, those who aren't at the top can see things more clearly, things that others overlook." A chuckle escaped Mr. Thompson, who seemed genuinely entertained by her courage. Around the table, a few other investors exchanged impressed glances, clearly appreciating her directness. It was becoming clear that Laura, though brought here as a silent companion, had a presence that couldn't be dismissed. Michael's irritation boiled over, but he held his tongue, aware of the powerful men observing him and trying to maintain his composure. When the dinner finally concluded, he couldn't even bring himself to walk out alongside Laura. Instead, he strode off ahead, clearly eager to escape the unexpected spectacle of the evening. Laura followed at her own pace, head held high. She knew she'd spoken her truth and, perhaps for the first time, felt that her voice had genuinely been heard. But little did she know, this night was only the beginning of what would prove to be a dramatic shift in her life and her relationship with Michael. Back at the mansion, Michael could barely contain his anger. He stormed into his office, his face flushed with frustration, and moments later, Laura walked in behind him, her demeanor calm but prepared for what was coming. Without any hint of patience, Michael waved her into a seat, though he didn't wait for her to settle before unleashing his anger. "What on earth were you thinking tonight, Laura?" he demanded, his voice cold and sharp. "I asked you to be discreet, not to steal the spotlight. You turned an important business dinner into your personal platform." Laura sat, unfazed by his rage. She knew this conversation wouldn't go well, but she didn't regret her actions. "I only responded to questions, Michael. All I did was share my opinion when someone asked for it," she replied, her tone controlled and calm. "Your opinion?" Michael shot back, his disdain clear. "You're my housekeeper, Laura. You're not paid to have an opinion at a business dinner. You went beyond your place and overstepped every boundary I set for you." Laura held her breath, swallowing the sting of his words. She could feel the injustice in what he was saying, that he saw her as nothing more than her job title. But she steadied herself, determined to respond without losing her composure. "If my presence was such an inconvenience, why did you ask me to come in the first place?" she asked, her voice low but firm. Michael's eyes narrowed, anger flashing across his face. "You were there to do a job, Laura, and that job included staying silent. You're getting paid, and that should have been enough." He leaned back, his gaze cold and unyielding. "Consider this your last day here. You're fired." The words hit her with finality, yet Laura managed to keep her composure. She felt the weight of the declaration but refused to let him see her falter. She nodded, rising with dignity, and gave Michael one last look before turning her back on him, leaving the mansion behind. As she walked away, a wave of clarity washed over her. For too long, she had allowed herself to be minimized, kept in a role that others had defined for her. But tonight she had seen her own potential, and losing her job seemed like a small price to pay for discovering that. The next day, as Laura packed her things, she received an unexpected call. On the other end of the line was none other than Mr. Thompson, the investor from the previous night. He spoke warmly, expressing his admiration for her courage and perspective. Then, he made her an offer that she hadn't even dared to imagine. With a deep sense of determination, Laura accepted, feeling that this was her chance to begin anew. The bitterness of being fired was quickly replaced by a growing excitement for what lay ahead. And as she stepped into this new chapter, she knew that the struggles of the past were only stepping stones to a brighter future. In the weeks that followed, Laura thrived in her new position under Mr. Thompson's guidance. She quickly proved herself to be a capable and insightful addition to the team, diving into projects with a focus and dedication that impressed her colleagues. For the first time, she felt like she was in a place where her ideas were valued, where her voice had weight. Laura discovered talents she hadn't previously had the chance to explore: strategic thinking, leadership, and a natural ability to connect with people. She had always possessed these qualities, but they had been hidden, unrecognized in the shadows of her previous role. Now, she was becoming a respected figure in the company, someone who others turned to for advice and perspective. The difference in her life was profound. Meanwhile, things were not going well for Michael. The crisis in his company continued to worsen, and the more he tried to regain control, the more it seemed to slip through his fingers. His desperate, short-sighted decisions, all focused on immediate profit, were backfiring, creating a snowball effect of issues he couldn't contain. His arrogant attitude, which had once been a source of power, was now isolating him from allies and driving away the business partners he needed most. The tables turned dramatically when Laura's new company acquired a significant share in Michael's struggling business. Her success was now directly intertwined with his downfall, and fate seemed to bring them together in a way neither of them could have anticipated. When the time came for a joint meeting of the company's leadership, Michael walked into the room, only to see Laura sitting confidently at the table, an equal among his former colleagues. The sight of her there, poised and self-assured, left him shaken. His once faithful housekeeper, whom he had dismissed without a second thought, was now in a position of influence, able to make decisions that would directly impact him. For a moment, he could only stare, unable to process how much had changed. It was as if he was looking at a different person, someone who had grown beyond anything he'd ever thought possible. When Laura noticed him, her expression remained composed, though her gaze was steady and unyielding. She wasn't there to gloat, she was there to do her job, one she took seriously. For her, this meeting was about moving forward, about proving her capabilities in a realm that had once seemed unreachable. After the formal discussions ended, Michael, still stunned, approached her. His voice was strained, tinged with disbelief. "Laura," he muttered, struggling to regain his composure. "So now you're here with them?" Laura met his gaze calmly. "Yes, I am," she replied, her tone even. "Our company now owns a significant stake in yours." Michael scoffed, masking his unease with a dismissive laugh. "This is absurd. You think that just because you have a title here, you understand what it takes to lead." Laura stood her ground, her voice steady but with a hint of quiet conviction. "Michael, while I worked for you, I learned exactly what leadership shouldn't look like. I learned to see beyond the arrogance that blinds people to what really matters." He stepped closer, frustration in his expression, his voice lowered to a sharp whisper. "Don't think that this changes anything between us. You're still just lucky. A lucky housekeeper who stumbled into an opportunity." But Laura, unfazed by his attempt to belittle her, simply crossed her arms, meeting his gaze. "That's the difference between us, Michael. I don't need your respect. I've earned my place here, and it wasn't by luck. You, on the other hand, are watching your own business crumble because you never valued anyone but yourself." The weight of her words seemed to hit him harder than he expected. He fell silent, for once without a sharp retort. For the first time, Michael felt a doubt creeping in, a crack in the armor of his confidence that he couldn't ignore. The woman he had once overlooked, who had once been invisible in his life, now stood as a mirror, reflecting back the flaws he had long refused to see. "Prove to me that I'm wrong," Laura challenged, her voice calm but carrying a force that left Michael stunned. "Show me that you still have the strength to lead and save your company. But remember, the fall is always swifter for those who believe they're untouchable." As she walked away, her words echoed in his mind, an undeniable truth he could no longer brush aside. Michael was left standing there, his confidence shaken, facing a truth he had long buried. And for the first time, he began to see that the path he was on could only lead to further ruin. After that confrontation, Michael found himself spiraling. Laura's words replayed in his mind, haunting him with their undeniable truth. For years, he had led with arrogance and a ruthless focus on profits, convincing himself that he alone could steer his company to success. But now, faced with the reality of his crumbling empire, he couldn't deny the toll his impulsive, ego-driven decisions had taken. In the quiet of his office that night, Michael was forced to reflect on the mistakes that had brought him here. One by one, he remembered the people he had dismissed, the colleagues he had alienated, and even his own family, whom he had neglected in favor of building his fortune. He had sacrificed relationships, loyalty, and trust, all in the name of success. But what had that success really brought him? The luxury he'd once reveled in now felt hollow, his home seemed empty, and his achievements felt meaningless. Days later, an important meeting was scheduled with the company's investors. This was a chance for Michael to regain some control, to convince them he still had what it took to lead. But he knew that any misstep could mark the end of his reign. Laura was already seated when he entered the room, reviewing some documents with a calm, focused demeanor. Her presence reminded him of just how much he had underestimated her, and a pang of regret twisted in his gut. As the meeting began, the head investor, Mr. Haynes, wasted no time getting to the point. "Michael," he began, his tone direct, "the situation in your company is troubling. We need a serious change, and we need it fast. Consider this your last chance to prove that you're capable of steering us out of this crisis." Michael swallowed, feeling the weight of every eye in the room on him. He launched into a carefully prepared speech, outlining a series of strategies designed to salvage the company's future. But as he spoke, he noticed the skeptical glances exchanged around the table. His words sounded hollow, even to himself, nothing more than a rehash of the same short-sighted goals he'd always focused on: quick gains and instant results. Just when he began to falter, Laura raised her voice, cutting through the silence. "The focus of this company needs to shift," she said, her tone firm but calm. "Profit alone isn't enough. We need to connect with our customers and our community on a meaningful level. That means a commitment to something bigger than ourselves." The investors leaned in, visibly more engaged. Mr. Haynes gestured for her to continue, and Laura spoke with confidence, outlining her vision for integrating social projects and humanizing the brand. She painted a picture of a sustainable future, where the company's reputation was built not on sheer profit but on its positive impact. Michael sat in silence, powerless to deny the effect Laura's words had on everyone in the room. He felt the admiration of the investors gravitate toward her, as if they could sense the depth and sincerity behind her ideas. In that moment, he realized that she wasn't just saving his company, she was leading it in a way he had never been able to. As the meeting concluded, the investors' focus remained on Laura's proposals, and their confidence in her was palpable. Mr. Haynes even paused to commend her as they filed out of the room, an acknowledgement that left Michael feeling more defeated than ever. He lingered in the hallway, unable to leave just yet, and when Laura finally noticed him standing there, she paused, giving him a steady look. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of disbelief and bitterness. "Why would you help save my company after everything?" Laura took a deep breath, her gaze unwavering. "Because, Michael," she said quietly, "unlike you, I believe in people. And more than that, I believe in the potential of this company. With or without you." Her words struck him harder than he expected, leaving him standing there in silence. As Laura walked away, Michael felt a crack in his pride, a small but undeniable shift that filled him with an unfamiliar sensation. It wasn't just failure that stung, it was the realization that he had become everything he'd once despised. For the first time, Michael found himself facing the possibility of real change, a path that would require him to confront his own flaws, his mistakes, and his lack of humility. He didn't know if he could do it, but for the first time, he felt something other than fear. He felt the faintest spark of determination to become a better person, a spark he knew he had to nurture if he had any hope of rebuilding his life. The days following the meeting were filled with a newfound sense of purpose for Michael, though it was a fragile thing, easily overshadowed by his lingering doubts. He spent his days buried in reflection, haunted by memories of the many times he'd put his pride and ambition above everything else. And for the first time, he realized how alone he had become. His once loyal employees had grown distant, his business partners were hesitant, and the investors had lost faith. Despite everything, Michael knew he couldn't face this journey alone. Swallowing his pride, He reached out to Laura, hoping for guidance. She was initially cautious, her demeanor cool and reserved, but there was a glimmer of recognition in her eyes as if she saw the small, vulnerable side of him he rarely showed. "Laura," he began with a hesitant voice, "I know I've made mistakes. I know I've hurt people along the way. But I want to change. I just don't know if I can do it alone." Laura looked at him for a long moment, measuring his sincerity. There was a part of her that wanted to keep her guard up, to protect herself from any chance of being hurt again by a man who had shown her so little respect. But she also knew the value of second chances, the strength it took to admit failure and seek a new path. "Michael," she replied softly, "change isn't something that happens overnight. It's a daily practice, a commitment to yourself and to others. If you're truly willing, you need to start by listening, by understanding that leadership isn't about control, it's about service." Her words echoed in his mind, striking a chord he hadn't realized was there. For years, he had led by fear, by demanding results and expecting obedience. But Laura's view of leadership was different. It was something born of empathy, patience, and a genuine desire to build others up. It was a concept foreign to him, yet one he felt compelled to understand. Eager to take his first step, Michael accepted Laura's invitation to attend a community meeting organized through the company's latest social project. The project focused on supporting women in vulnerable situations, providing them with skills and opportunities to rebuild their lives. As Michael entered the modest meeting room, he felt a wave of discomfort wash over him. He was used to the polished surroundings of boardrooms and executive suites, not this raw, unfiltered reality. Seated among the group were single mothers, women who had survived abusive relationships, and others fighting to support their families despite the odds stacked against them. Laura introduced Michael to the group, explaining that he was there to listen, to understand their experiences and challenges. It was the first time he'd ever been in a position where he wasn't the authority figure, the one with all the answers. And to his surprise, he found himself captivated by their stories. Toward the end of the meeting, an older woman with a gentle but firm voice approached him. Her name was Margaret, and she carried an air of resilience that came from years of hardship. "You're Mr. Michael Adams, right? The owner of the company supporting this project?" she asked. Michael nodded, feeling a sense of unease under her steady gaze. "Yes, that's me," he replied quietly. Margaret studied him for a moment before speaking. "My son worked for you a few years ago. He gave everything to that job, but he was let go without a single word of thanks or explanation. It nearly broke him. And now, seeing you here, I can only hope things have changed." Her words hit Michael like a punch to the gut. The pain and disappointment in her voice were unmistakable, a painful reminder of the countless people he had discarded in his relentless pursuit of profit. He swallowed hard, realizing that he had no easy answer to offer her. "I'm sorry," he managed, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I didn't know. But I'm here because I want to change." Margaret nodded slowly, as if weighing the sincerity in his words. "I hope you mean that. There's people like us. We remember. And we deserve better." That encounter stayed with Michael long after the meeting ended, casting a heavy shadow over his thoughts. For years, he had been the kind of leader who never looked back, never stopped to consider the consequences of his actions. But Margaret's words had pierced through his defenses, laying bare the wounds he had inflicted without even realizing it. Back at the office, he found Laura and thanked her for bringing him to the meeting. "I think I finally understand what you meant, Laura," he admitted, his voice full of genuine emotion. "This project isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about people, real people whose lives depend on what we do." Laura's expression softened, a hint of understanding and perhaps even pride in her gaze. "This is just the beginning, Michael. Real change takes time and commitment, but I believe you're starting to see what leadership truly means." Her words ignited a spark of hope in him, one he hadn't felt in years. And for the first time, he felt that he might actually have a chance to become the leader he'd always pretended to be. In the weeks that followed, Michael made it a point to immerse himself fully in the project, embracing every opportunity to understand the community he'd once viewed as merely a statistic. With Laura's guidance, he began attending meetings, listening more than he spoke, and participating in the day-to-day work of the project. For a man who had spent years sitting at the top, this level of humility was a jarring but necessary change. One day, Laura took him to a workshop organized by the project's team, where the participants were learning skills they could use to find employment. Michael found himself sitting alongside the women, watching as they focused intently on their training. Among them was Julia, a young mother who, through the project, had finally secured a stable job, giving her the chance to support her child. During a break, she approached Michael, gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thank you for supporting this project," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "Without it, I don't know where I'd be. My daughter now has a better life, and it means everything to me." Michael felt a lump in his throat as he listened to her. Her words were a reminder that the decisions he made from his office had real, lasting consequences. For years, he had looked at his business as a machine for profit, yet here was proof that it could also be a force for good. In that moment, he understood that his power could be used not just for his own gain, but to make a tangible difference in people's lives. Back at the office, Michael shared his thoughts with Laura. His voice was different now, filled with a sincerity and resolve she hadn't seen in him before. "You were right, Laura. I used to see this as just another venture, something that would improve my reputation and maybe make me look better in the eyes of the investors. But it's so much more than that. Today, I realize that I can actually create something meaningful, something that impacts real lives." Laura regarded him thoughtfully, sensing the shift in his perspective. "So what are you going to do with this realization, Michael?" she asked, challenging him. He took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "I want to commit to this fully. I want to support the people behind the numbers, to ensure they have a future worth looking forward to. I want to become the kind of leader who inspires trust and respect, not because of titles, but because of actions." For the first time, Laura saw genuine growth in him, a desire to be better that wasn't just surface level. She nodded approvingly. "Then prove it to us, Michael. Let every decision reflect this commitment. Show everyone that this change isn't just words but a way of life." From that day on, Michael continued to immerse himself in the project, transforming his role from that of a distant CEO to an active participant. He spent hours with the team, listening to their concerns, understanding their struggles, and working tirelessly to support their vision. Gradually, his actions began to speak for themselves. The board members, once skeptical, started noticing the subtle but profound change in him. In board meetings, he now approached discussions with a calm, humble demeanor, presenting his ideas without the grandiosity he once favored. Instead of pushing his agenda, he listened carefully to feedback, crediting the team for their contributions and always acknowledging Laura's pivotal role in steering the company in a new direction. One day, during a particularly successful meeting, Mr. Haynes, the board chairman, took a moment to address Michael directly. "It's clear that you've put in a lot of work, Michael. This project is making a real impact, and it's evident in the numbers, and more importantly, in the lives of those we're helping. I'm proud to see you leading with purpose." Michael received the praise with quiet humility, his mind going back to all the people who had helped him reach this point. Laura, in particular, had been a beacon of strength and wisdom. She had seen through his flaws, guided him through his failures, and pushed him to grow in ways he'd never thought possible. As he looked across the room at Laura, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for her role in his journey. What had once been merely professional admiration had evolved into something more, a feeling he hadn't expected but couldn't deny. Laura had not only shown him the path to redemption but had also opened his heart in ways he hadn't thought possible. In the following weeks, Michael found himself drawn to Laura on a more personal level. He began to notice the little things, the way she laughed when sharing a success story from the project, the kindness she showed to everyone she worked with, and the quiet determination in her every action. She wasn't just a brilliant leader, she was a remarkable woman, someone who had shown him a better way to live and lead. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Michael and Laura stayed late to go over some final details for an upcoming event. As the room quieted and the last rays of sunlight faded, Michael felt an overwhelming urge to share what had been weighing on his heart. "Laura," he began softly, "I don't think I've ever met anyone like you. You've changed my life in ways I can't even begin to explain." She looked up, slightly surprised by the intensity of his words, but a gentle smile crossed her face. "You did the hard work, Michael. I just showed you a different way." But he shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "It's more than that. You've shown me what it means to live with purpose, with integrity. And because of you, I finally understand what it means to lead." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the room felt still, as if acknowledging the connection between them. In that moment, they both sensed that something had shifted, a deep, unspoken understanding that went beyond their professional relationship. And as they sat in the quiet of that office, they knew that their story was far from over. The line between their professional and personal lives continued to blur as Michael and Laura spent more time together. Their partnership, once built on mentorship and guidance, had evolved into something richer, something that neither of them could ignore. Michael, who had once guarded his heart as tightly as he ran his business, now found himself captivated by Laura in ways he had never expected. Their dynamic shifted in subtle but undeniable ways. Michael began to suggest lunches after meetings, casual walks through the city after a long day, or moments shared over coffee as they discussed the project's future. They shared stories about their pasts, dreams they hadn't spoken aloud, and fears they were only now beginning to understand. Slowly, they built a connection that was rooted in trust, mutual respect, and an unmistakable affection. One night, after a long workday, they found themselves alone in the office, the soft glow of desk lamps casting a warm light across the room. The atmosphere was quiet, intimate, and as they reviewed reports side by side, Michael felt an overwhelming urge to express what had been weighing on his heart. "Laura," he said, breaking the silence, his voice filled with a sincerity that caught her attention. "I know I've thanked you for everything you've done, but I don't think I can ever fully express how much you've changed my life. Before I met you, I thought success was all about control and power. But you taught me that true success is about creating something meaningful, something that lasts." Laura looked at him, surprised and touched by the depth of his words. "Michael, seeing this change in you, seeing you grow into the leader you've become, it's one of the most rewarding things I've ever experienced." Their eyes met, and for a moment, there was a charged silence, filled with everything left unsaid. Slowly, Michael reached out, taking her hand in his, and the warmth between them felt like a promise. "Laura," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper, "I think I've fallen in love with you." For a heartbeat, the world felt suspended. Laura's face softened, her eyes shining with emotion as she replied, "I've fallen in love with you too, Michael. I was just too afraid to admit it." Relief and joy washed over him, and without another word, he leaned in, their lips meeting in a tender, heartfelt kiss. It was a moment of pure connection, a culmination of months of shared battles, personal growth, and an undeniable bond that had woven their lives together. In the days that followed, Michael and Laura's relationship blossomed in a way that felt both natural and profound. Their love brought a new level of depth to their partnership, and their mutual dedication to the project grew even stronger. They were no longer just colleagues, they were partners in the truest sense, working side by side to achieve something meaningful together. As the project gained traction, the company's reputation flourished, recognized not just for profit but for its commitment to making a positive impact. Under Michael and Laura's leadership, the project expanded to other communities, offering hope and opportunities to countless people. The board, once skeptical of Michael's vision, now celebrated his transformation, and Mr. Haynes even publicly praised him for his integrity and dedication. Michael's journey from a man obsessed with power to a true leader inspired those around him, but it was his partnership with Laura that brought out his best qualities. Together, they became an unstoppable team, building a legacy that transcended their individual ambitions. Months later, surrounded by friends, family, colleagues, and members of the community they had helped, Michael and Laura exchanged vows in a small, intimate ceremony. It wasn't just a celebration of love, it was a commitment to continue their shared mission of creating lasting change. As they danced under the stars, Michael felt a sense of peace and fulfillment he had never known before. He held Laura close, grateful for every step that had led him to this moment. The man who had once believed success was measured by wealth and influence now understood that the truest legacy was built with love, purpose, and compassion. Together, they set off on a new journey, one that promised to be filled with as many challenges as rewards. But now, they knew they would face everything side by side, bound by a love that had changed them both. And as they looked toward their future, they saw a path filled not just with personal happiness but with the promise of a legacy that would continue to inspire and uplift others for generations to come. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. Your interest and support inspire us to bring you more captivating tales filled with emotions, twists, and the complexity of life, love, betrayal, and redemption. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a comment and share your thoughts. We value your voice and want to hear what you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new story, and hit the notification bell to stay updated. Thank you for bringing this channel to life with your views and encouragement. See you in the next story.